The New Communist Movement, Party Building in 1970s America. Many of the young Americans who grew up hating McCarthyism and Cold War conformity and became involved in protesting for civil rights and against the Vietnam War eventually became communists. For some, the awakening came sooner than for others. From the late 60s to the early 1980s, a wave of new Marxist-Leninist parties emerged, many of them aligned with China, most of them with roots in the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 faction of Students for a Democratic Society. This current is generally referred to as the New Communist Movement, NCM, by academics. The various groups had very limited success throughout the 1970s as the divisions in the ruling class intensified. In a few places, most notably Detroit, the NCM had substantial influence over the population and within local government. The organizations played a role in some rather explosive events to close out the decade. And after Reagan's victory in the 1980 election, they began to fade in relevance and dissolve. The NCM is worth studying because, unlike the left that remained after its demise, these organizations had a more or less mass orientation. They sought to be a party of the American people in their millions, often specifically aiming to recruit industrial workers. The NCM's failure was due to a number of conditions working against them. The labor aristocracy was pretty solidly intact, and the bulk of the white working class rejected class struggle politics. China, the country from which they sought ideological guidance, was shifting its politics very rapidly and aligning with the United States. There were also a few fundamental errors in approach that were widespread and are worth discussing. Overall, the NCM should be studied and revisited because many of the lessons of the period absorbed by the current leadership of various Marxist-Leninist sects are incorrect and need to be unlearned. A new perspective on the politics of the era and its successes and failures is worth exploring. The new left that first worked to support Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and end segregation, and then later mobilized pacifist marches for de-escalation and negotiation in Vietnam, was not a grassroots phenomenon. It developed because of big disagreements within the ruling class, springing from the wave of anti-imperialist uprisings around the world. The question of how the Black community should be handled, and the huge importance of military spending in stabilizing the post-World War II U.S. economy. From 1946 to 1971, the world experienced the greatest wave of economic growth in human history, referred to by economists as the post-World War II economic expansion. The USA had the highest standard of living in the world. Industrial workers could afford comfortable suburban homes with only one working husband, often without even a high school diploma, supporting a wife and 2 to 3 children. At first, the ruling class had swung in a right-wing direction, crushing the Communist Party and weakening the organized labor movement with the Taft-Hartley Law. But soon, McCarthyite fanaticism turned into a vehicle with which Bonapartist and middle-class elements could threaten some of the wealthiest capitalists. Meanwhile, the treatment of African Americans had been something communists had rallied against, and many in the ruling class felt it needed to be properly addressed or adjusted. The roots of the new left began with the lynching of Emmett Till in August of 1955. The Black teenager, 14 years old, from Chicago, had been visiting relatives in Mississippi. He was accused of whistling at a white woman in a local store owned by a white family. That night, the store owner and his sons abducted Emmett Till from his home and tortured him to death. Similar vigilante killings by whites to enforce the racist structure of the South happened all the time. At Emmett Till's funeral in Chicago, his mother arranged for an open casket to show how brutally her 14-year-old son had been mutilated. Mamie Till explained her decision, saying, "There was just no way I could describe what was in that box. No way. And I wanted the world to see." Photographs taken by Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender of Emmett Till's corpse generated a huge amount of outrage. And as the news spread, many Northern politicians called for the murderers of Emmett Till to be prosecuted. In a 5-day trial in September, the killers of Till were found not guilty by an all-white jury, prompting outrage and protest across the country. The following year, the two killers of Emmett Till, Roy Bryant and John William Millam, published their account of how they murdered Emmett Till in Look magazine, saying they felt it was necessary to keep the local black population, quote, in their place. Millam said, "I just decided it was time that a few people got put on notice. As long as I live and can do anything about it, N-words are going to stay in their place. N-words ain't going to vote where I live. If they did, they'd control the government. If they did, they'd go to school with my kids. And when an N-word gets close to mentioning sex with a white woman, he's tired of living and I'm likely to kill him," unquote. Wow. The Soviet Union sent the image of Till's mutilated body across the world, and it accompanied William L. Patterson's document, We Charge Genocide, published a few years prior and presented by the USSR at the United Nations. In response to Till's killing and the Soviet Union's publicization of it, the Kennedy family and many Northern liberals organized vigils and protest marches in urban centers against racism and Jim Crow. Then, in December of 1955, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with the financial support of the United Auto Workers, launched the Montgomery bus boycott, demanding that the bus lines in Montgomery, Alabama, drop their policy requiring black people to ride in the back of the bus and to give up their seats for whites. Rosa Parks was quoted in national media explaining why she refused to sit in the back of the bus, saying, quote, "I thought of Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back." The black community refused to ride local bus lines. The Montgomery bus boycott ended December 20th, 1956, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the segregation laws on Alabama buses violated the U.S. Constitution. It was a victory that pushed the civil rights movement forward. Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to lead the boycott because he was young enough to have not been associated with the Communist Party in any way. All the older black ministers who were willing to oppose Jim Crow had some connection with the communists, as they were among the only anti-racist activists in the South. The Communist Party's Civil Rights Congress provided lawyers and support to black people facing the death penalty in Jim Crow courts, and Soviet officials frequently condemned the United States for its treatment of African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. became the public face of a new upsurge of protests throughout the country, called the Civil Rights Movement, using the term civil rights, which the Communist Party had coined in the late 1940s as its buzz phrase for pro-black activism. However, the Communist Party was largely unwelcome in what was a well-funded, well-publicized mobilization paid for by liberals. Funding from the United Auto Workers Union and the Institute for Policy Studies, as well as various Rockefeller foundations and the Ford Foundation, enabled young Americans, black and white, to attend freedom schools and get trained in the art of civil disobedience. The philosophy that they were taught was Gandhian pacifism and Protestant Christianity. These young protesters believed that they were helping to make the U.S. true to its democratic ideals and subjecting themselves to persecution and martyrdom while turning the other cheek in a Christ-like way. The freedom schools were known for their atmosphere of repetitive singing, chanting, and clapping. Mainstream media showed the police brutalizing young white radicals, creating a great deal of sympathy for ending legal segregation on a national level. Liberal TV hosts like Lester Crane and Edward R. Murrow lampooned McCarthyist conservatives and shamed Mississippi and Alabama for their apartheid conditions. Basically, a wing of the U.S. ruling class had decided that racism was hurting the interests of U.S. imperialism and was willing to help mobilize youth to oppose it. This created an opening for genuine radicals. John Steele, a civil rights activist who was involved in the 1964 Freedom Summer in Mississippi and who eventually became a communist, recalled, "What swept me into the civil rights struggle was in large part the utter moral clarity of what was involved. The clear evil of institutionalized white supremacy and the courage and nobility represented by the movement, which was going directly up against it. Year after year during the 50s and early 60s, college-aged radicals joined African Americans in getting arrested at lunch counters and bus stations, enduring police batons, and calling for an end to legal segregation. In 1963, the University of California at Berkeley banned students from organizing around off-campus issues. This meant those recruiting for the civil rights movement and organizing boycotts of local businesses in California that opposed civil rights were forbidden from doing so on campus. Opposition to these restrictions led to a student uprising called the Free Speech Movement. On October 1st, students seized a police car after Jack Weinberg, a member of the Congress of Racial Equality, was arrested for setting up a civil rights table on the campus. 3,000 students surrounded the police car, and a speaker's podium was put on top of it. The students held the car for 32 hours, giving speeches on top of it, before the authorities agreed to drop the charges against Weinberg. The students later seized an academic building, and hundreds were arrested, dragged out one by the police. The leader of the free speech movement was Mario Savio, and his famous words on the steps of Sproul Hall before the students seized it on December 2nd of 1964 became an iconic expression of the sentiments of radical youth at the time, motivated by opposition to Cold War conformity. He famously said, "There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies on the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it and to the people who own it that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." Bob Avakian, a Berkeley student who joined the protests shortly after recovering from a life-threatening illness, recalled the civil disobedience arrests in his autobiography From Ike to Mao and Beyond, recalling, "People were arrested in an almost assembly line fashion. As they were arrested, a lot of people were thrown down the stairs, and the women in particular were grabbed by the hair and thrown down the stairs. I was on the top floor and saw many people brutalized like that. And of course, this was only a few months after I had been finally recovered from being sick. So besides being outraged generally, I was a little worried about what might happen to me if I got thrown down the stairs or otherwise brutalized, especially if I got hit in the area of my kidneys. And as my turn came to be busted, I recognized the cop who was arresting me as someone who had played basketball for a local college. I saw his nameplate say Gray, and I said, 'Aren't you the Gray who played basketball for St. Mary's?' And I kind of shrugged my shoulders as if to say, 'So what are you going to do?' And he replied, 'Sorry, I can't do nothing for you.' And off I went. Of course, I was very happy to be arrested, to put it that way. I wanted to be part of this, and there was a great camaraderie. When I did this thing with this cop Gray, I wasn't trying to not get arrested. I just didn't want to get thrown down the stairs and hit in my kidneys. But I was very happy to be part of this." Eventually, the university gave in and altered its policies to allow activism and political organizing among the students. Soon, the UC Berkeley and other prestigious campuses, including Eastern Ivy League schools, became centers of the movement, with students engaging in civil rights activism, often challenging the restrictions on their activities imposed by college administrations. Within the campus upsurge, the Communist Party USA and a few small Trotskyite sects were visible on the margins. The right-wing press made a big deal out of their presence, and the paid organizers of these liberal mobilizations did their best to push communists into the background and denounce them. Progressive Labor Party was the most visible communist presence in the early 1960s, making a point of publicly speaking as communists as often as possible. The Progressive Labor Party, originally known as the Progressive Labor Movement, or commonly just called PL, was a breakaway from the Communist Party USA, led by Milton Rosen, a college professor from Buffalo, New York. The group denounced the Communist Party USA as revisionist, and it sold its newspaper Challenge around the country, defending Stalin against Khrushchev and pointing to China as the center of world revolution. Progressive Labor Party was present in the civil rights protests and other mobilizations of the early 60s, viewed as a group of radical fringe. However, the organization began expanding rapidly as the political crisis intensified, having carved out its position as the most visible representative of communism in radical circles. Ramparts magazine sprung up in San Francisco's Bay Area, 1962, originally as a publication aimed at promoting creative writing among Roman Catholics. However, after a few years, the publication became a vehicle for exposing CIA activities and promoting anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and pro-communist politics. Declassified documents show that the FBI strongly believed that the publication was funded by the Soviet Union or by China, or perhaps both, but could never find substantial proof. The Bay Area magazine became an essential part of the political upsurge of the 1960s and the subsequent new communist movement. One of the main organizations of young people engaging in civil disobedience was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and it was led by Stokely Carmichael, who eventually changed his name to Kwame Ture. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began using the slogan Black Power in the early 1960s, and it diverged from the mainstream of the civil rights movement by becoming friendlier to Black nationalism. A number of activists who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were young African Americans who had resigned from the Communist Party in 1958 after it officially dropped its support for Black nationalism. Many of them listened to the radio broadcasts of Robert F. Williams, a civil rights leader who advocated armed self-defense and had fled to Cuba. Radio Free Dixie was broadcast from Havana into southern states and featured calls by Williams for the launching of armed struggle by Black nationalists. Among SNCC activists who listened to Williams' broadcasts and considered themselves to be communists, a clandestine organization called the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM, was established. The group's aim was to create a new communist party aligned with China that would lead Black Americans to form a separate, independent Black republic in the South. Malcolm X met with RAM members before his assassination. RAM pamphlets and literature were circulated among young Black activists and civil rights organizers. Eventually, two RAM members named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale broke away to form the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California in 1966. This organization proliferated throughout the 1960s and 70s, facing heavy FBI repression. Among young white activists involved in civil rights, opposition to the Vietnam War and the draft became a new cause to organize around. The first protests against the Vietnam War had been organized by Youth Against War and Fascism and the Progressive Labor Party, but soon a new liberal campus group with lots of funding emerged. Students for a Democratic Society was founded in Port Huron, Michigan, as a campus-based activist group that opposed the Vietnam War, advocated for civil rights, and sought to create a participatory democracy that involved workers' councils running factories. The group banned communists from joining and received millions of dollars from a Democratic Party-aligned labor union in order to set up shop on the campuses around the country with a crew of full-time paid organizers. The founders included Tom Hayden, Michael Harrington, and Todd Gitlin, and they received significant salaries for their paid work, organizing a new activist group on American campuses. The organization aimed to push back against the military-industrial complex and anti-civil rights conservatives. The Progressive Labor Party immediately sent its members to infiltrate SDS, despite its ban on communists. And despite efforts to keep them out, the Progressive Labor Party found its way into SDS on a number of campuses. The Communist Party formed a network of W.E.B. Du Bois clubs for young civil rights activists whose members also joined SDS. With popular rock bands and mainstream media promoting protests against the Vietnam War, the movement grew in big numbers. However, the bulk of those involved were not communists. As anti-war protests grew larger, they were dominated by pacifist religious groups, counterculture hippies who spoke of a generation gap, and a wave of Eastern mystical religious sects with ties to the CIA, such as the Tibetan Buddhists and the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Hare Krishna. The intellectuals cultivated by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom set the tone, and the new left was up and running. The message was opposition to conformity, do your own thing, love your brother against the establishment of squares and fascists who were uptight. The Rockefeller think tanks, the CIA, the Ford Foundation, and a figure from the Kennedy administration named McGeorge Bundy were funding and fomenting a mass movement for their own reasons. Communists were always there among the wider mobilizations of liberal forces and around the world. It was communist governments that cheered the loudest in support of the Black freedom struggle and in opposition to U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The climax of the 1960s political upsurge came in 1968 and 1969. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and every major city went up in flames, with the black community exploding in rage. A year prior to his assassination, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had denounced the Vietnam War in a speech at Riverside Church. In the speech, he said, "These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in the darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions." King denounced Marxism, began openly speaking in support of democratic socialism, and he became a friend of SDS founder and social democrat Michael Harrington. King was involved in planning a poor people's campaign at the time of his death, hoping to mobilize low-income people, both white and black, to engage in a series of civil disobedience protests in Washington, D.C., to demand an expansion of the welfare state. The death of Martin Luther King Jr. launched an explosion of rioting in the black community. Campus radicals at New York City's Columbia University shut down the campus in weeks of prolonged unrest, seizing campus buildings. SDS was the main organization leading the protests, with Mark Rudd acting as the spokesperson. Anti-war Democratic presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, who was associated with support for civil rights, was assassinated on June 6th. From August 26th to 29th, the Democratic Party held its national convention in Chicago and nominated Hubert Humphrey, a pro-Vietnam War candidate, for president, despite widespread opposition to the war. Outside the convention, thousands of students were beaten and arrested in the streets of Chicago at protests organized by Students for a Democratic Society and the national mobilization to oppose the war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, appealing to the silent majority that objected to the widespread unrest in the country and promised a swift crackdown on the New Left and the Black radicals. In 1969, the protests against the Vietnam War grew bigger, and 2 national moratorium days and many rallies in Washington, D.C., with hundreds of thousands of participants. The Black Panther Party expanded its ranks, facing a heavy FBI crackdown. In the spring of 1970, when it became clear that the U.S. war in Vietnam had expanded into Cambodia, students' protests escalated. Students at Kent State University in Ohio and Jackson State University in Mississippi were shot and killed in the protests. To many of those involved in the protests, the issues of racism and the drive for war appeared more and more to be rooted in capitalism. The communists around the world seemed to be on the rise and correct in their explanation of world events. The layer of people who became communists before, during, or shortly after the uprisings of 1968 and 1969 went on to form the nucleus of what is called the new communist movement. An assessment of their experiences, successes, and failures is an essential part of the understanding that lays the basis for the contemporary work of the Center for Political Innovation. Students for a Democratic Society was the main vehicle through which 1960s new leftists who moved in a communist direction converged. The group claimed 2 million members in 1969. By that time, the ban on communists had been dropped, and the two communist factions, both of which took inspiration from China rather than the Soviet Union, dominated the organization. The largest presence within SDS was the Progressive Labor Party. PLP had been founded by pro-Stalin members who had quit the Communist Party in the early 1960s. Progressive Labor Party had organized illegal trips to Cuba to defy the travel ban when it was imposed in the early 1960s. While the Communist Party concealed its views and operated as a kind of semi-secret organization among the wider liberal, pacifist, and civil rights circles, Progressive Labor Party did the opposite, screaming communism at the top of its lungs. Progressive Labor Party was most likely the first communist organization that any activist would come into contact with. The group waved red flags, carried pictures of Mao and Stalin, and sang, "Give me that old communism," to the tune of "Give me that old-time religion." Progressive Labor Party members condemned hippie counterculture as bourgeois decadence and forbid members to use drugs or to have long hair. Young recruits to Progressive Labor Party were encouraged to spend their summer break working in factories, selling newspapers to their co-workers. Progressive Labor Party opposed property destruction in campus protests, saying it made more work for campus employees and was therefore anti-working class. By the late 1960s, the politics of the Progressive Labor Party were shifting away from the global communist movement. When the Vietnamese National Liberation Front began negotiating with the United States in Paris in the hopes of ending the war, Progressive Labor Party condemned this as selling out and claiming that the revisionist leaders were holding back a, quote, real revolution in Vietnam. Progressive Labor Party members were known to condemn the Vietnamese for shooting at U.S. troops rather than trying to recruit them and give them leaflets as they were the working class. Progressive Labor Party proclaimed revolutionaries must fight nationalism, and on this basis condemned all organizing on nationalist lines, emphasizing a strict workers versus bosses understanding. As the Black Panthers emerged as the symbol of Black revolutionary activism, Progressive Labor Party condemned the Black Panthers as Black fascists and reverse racists, invoking Lenin's critique of the Jewish Bund. These positions, along with their anti-counterculture stances, pushed Progressive Labor Party to be more and more isolated from student radicals. Progressive Labor Party also maintained a very dumbed-down political atmosphere, eventually not even referring to Marxism-Leninism or quoting from Marxist texts, but just talking about fight for socialism, win communism, with a fight between the workers and the bosses. PLP began referring to the Soviet government as the fake red bosses and more or less distanced itself from the communist governments, all the communist governments in the world except for China. After China's foreign policy began shifting in the 1970s, they denounced China as well. The shift in PLP's politics that was emerging during the late 60s came as a result of internal dynamics. Due to the Black freedom struggle, the role of communists in African liberation, Progressive Labor Party was becoming a majority Black organization. Bill Epton was a very effective organizer of the group in Harlem and was sent to prison for his activism. Older white leaders of Progressive Labor Party felt threatened by the number of young black radicals who joined the organization and also admired the Black Panthers and various Soviet-aligned African revolutionaries. In their document, The Five Retreats, A History of the Failure of the Progressive Labor Party, Jim Dan and Harry Dillon explained the trajectory of the organization's emerging opposition to the Black Liberation Movement and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. At the PLP convention of 1968, on the motion of Milt Rosen, the party's Black Liberation Commission, which had been headed by Bill Epton, was stripped of all authority and soon went out of existence. In January 1969, the party lost its very popular 2-year-old Liberation bookstore in Harlem when the manager, Una Malzek, was expelled from the Progressive Labor Party because she refused to buy the Progressive Labor Party's retreat from the Black Liberation Movement. Rosen characterized the bookstore as a nationalist center in Harlem, and he pushed Epton to struggle with Malzek to challenge the nationalist character of it, meaning sell more challenges and less material about the Black Liberation Movement. Malzek, a well-known black woman Marxist leader in Harlem, was expelled. She and her co-workers in the bookstore then expelled Progressive Labor Party from the bookstore. Progressive Labor Party had no serious desire to take back the bookstore. The party lost interest in the Marxist-Leninist Center in Harlem. Meanwhile, within the National Committee, criticism of Bill Epton, the only remaining black leader in New York, sharply mounted. At the convention, the post of vice president of the party, which had been held since 1965, was quietly abolished. All this more and more clearly indicated a strong craving of the Milt Rosen leadership to get out of the Black Liberation Movement at all costs. Inside of Students for a Democratic Society, Progressive Labor Party pushed opposition to the Black Panthers and to supporting the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. They instead wanted SDS to get more jobs in factories and urged their co-workers to fight the bosses with wildcat strikes as part of a workers-student alliance. The opponents of the Progressive Labor Party inside of SDS, including most of the organization's well-known public faces, took on the name Revolutionary Youth Movement, but soon became known by their nickname, Weatherman, after a document that they published entitled, You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows. In examining why they expelled Progressive Labor Party from the organization, Revolutionary Youth Movement wrote, SDS is an organization of revolutionary youth. We are building a fighting force in the heart of the U.S. empire to struggle against the exploitation and oppression of the people of the world. The Progressive Labor Party and the Workers' Student Alliance that built progressive labor inside of SDS are counter-revolutionaries who oppose the struggles of the world's people against U.S. imperialism. We have also come to understand as white people who live in the heart of imperialism that although exploited by capitalism, we receive minor privileges in the form of crumbs off of the imperialist table. If we are ever to achieve our own liberation, it must come from fighting on the side of the people of the world against the imperialist monster, fighting on the side of the Vietnamese, the blacks, and browns, supporting their struggle and actively participating in international war. Unlike the Progressive Labor Party, Revolutionary Youth Movement embraced hippie counterculture and announced that most white workers in America were bought off labor aristocrats or pigs. They argued that counterculture youth who had, quote, picked up a joint would be won to the side of the black freedom struggle and the anti-imperialist countries. White youth must take sides now, bring the war home, became the slogans of a wing of long-haired, drug-using activists who called themselves the Americong and waved the Vietnamese National Liberation Front flag at protests. The Weatherman men began staging kick-ass marches where they assembled and broke windows. At the 1969 SDS convention, the Progressive Labor Party and the Revolutionary Youth Movement parted ways in a chaos-filled gathering full of fistfights, profanity, and waving of Mao's Little Red Book. The SDS convention was a national news event as it descended into chaos. Both factions announced they were the real SDS. The Workers' Student Alliance, led by Progressive Labor Party, announced it was holding a work-in and would organize young radicals to get jobs in factories. Weatherman announced its plan for a series of violent protests called the Days of Rage in Chicago in the coming fall. Various youth associated with Weatherman lived together across the country and engaged in a variety of left adventurous street actions in the hopes of building up toward the events of October 8th through 11th. Weatherman announced that monogamy was reactionary and began encouraging its members to engage in group sex. The group also required members to be interrogated while under the influence of LSD to see if they were police infiltrators. Leaders of the Weather Collective houses around the country would subject members to, quote, gut checks, pressing them to do illegal and uncomfortable things to see how far they were willing to go. Many within the anti-progressive Labor Party faction of SDS were extremely uncomfortable with Weatherman's tactics and culture of violence. Bob Avakian, Mike Klonsky, Mary Lou Greenberg, and many others announced they were breaking with Weatherman to form Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, and they denounced the Days of Rage. When the Days of Rage kicked off on October 8th, the turnout was quite dismal. A crowd of roughly 300 people smashed windows and dodged police gunfire. Some bombs went off in the following few days. Richard Elrod, a prosecuting attorney in Chicago who enjoyed joining with police to beat up protesters, was paralyzed for life by a blow from a Weatherman baseball bat to the back of his neck. Hundreds were arrested. Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party denounced the Days of Rage. He announced that the Black Panthers were aligned with Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. In a TV interview asking if the Panthers supported the Days of Rage, he said, "We believe that the Weatherman action is anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic. And that's the bad part about it. It's custoristic, and that these leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred. And they call that revolution, that's child's play. It's folly. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddleheads, and they're scatterbrained." On December 4th, Fred Hampton was murdered in a planned police assassination. The press declared a vicious Panther attack and tried to blame the violence on the Panthers shooting at police, but tours of the apartment later proved that the Panthers had not fired a single shot. All the bullets came from the police, who had unloaded hundreds of rounds into Fred Hampton's body as he was sleeping in his bed. Hampton had unified the various gangs in Chicago into a rainbow coalition and was organizing them to fight for economic justice. He had started a breakfast program for children that was declared by the FBI to be the greatest internal threat to national security. J. Edgar Hoover wrote in an internal FBI document that the breakfast program, quote, promotes at least tacit support for the Black Panther Party among naive individuals, and what is more distressing, it provides the Black Panther Party with ready audiences composed of highly impressionable youths. Consequently, the Breakfast for Children program represents the best and most influential activity going for the Black Panthers. As such, is potentially the greatest threat to the efforts by authorities to neutralize the Black Panthers and destroy what it stands for. In the aftermath of Hampton's killing in December of 1969, the Weathermen convened a National War Council in Flint, Michigan. At the event, they celebrated the recent murders of Charles Manson in Los Angeles and announced plans to launch armed struggle, and declared that white workers were pigs who would go down with the ruling class. The leadership, Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, Mark Rudd, and Jeff Jones, were all the children of millionaires who had built up a reputation in the media as outlaws and extremists. An account of the National War Council published in The Guardian describes how one of the leaders of Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 confronted the leaders of Weatherman about their dismal dismissal of the white working class. Weatherman, virtually all white, continues to promote the notion that white working people in America are inherently counter-revolutionary, impossible to organize, or just plain evil honky bastards, as many Weathermen put it. Weatherman's bleak view of the post-revolutionary world comes from an analysis of American society that says class doesn't count, race does. White workers are in fact fighting for their survival, insisted people doing organizing work in California. They claim that the strikes for wage increases and job security can fairly easily be linked to anti-imperialist analysis. But Weatherman denies that survival is an issue for the white workers. Weatherman leader Howie Matchinger derided white workers for desiring better homes, better food, and essentially better lives. Bob Avakian from the Revolutionary Union of the Bay Area argued not only do white workers need those things for their survival, but that black people need them and want them too. The several black people who Weatherman had brought to the meeting shouted right on and waved their fists. If you can't understand that white workers are being screwed too, that they are oppressed by capitalism before they are racist, then you have just shown your class origins, said Avakian. Matchinger shot back, when you try to defend honky workers who just want more privilege from imperialism, you show your race origins. The Weatherman position boiled down to inevitable race war in America, with very few honkies, except perhaps the 400 people in the room, and a few street kids or gang members who might run with them, surviving the Holocaust. That notion is linked to Weatherman's concept of initiating armed struggle now and not waiting to build mass white support. That is, a small but courageous white fighting force will do material damage that will weaken imperialism while the Black liberation movement smashes the imperialist motherfucker by itself. Matchinger talked a lot about how the Black liberation movement is so far advanced at this point that the only thing left for white revolutionaries to do is support blacks by fighting cops as a diversionary tactic. Shortly after the Flint War Council, the Weatherman disappeared. The overwhelming majority of the members had no information and simply found the offices locked and abandoned. Later, a small group of 30 to 60 people began conducting symbolic bombings, operating as a completely clandestine organization. With Weatherman having disappeared into a small ultra-leftist terrorist organization, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, too, found itself in the position of being the primary communist organization that supported the Black Panthers and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. RIM 2 was a mishmash of different radicals from around the country, most college-aged. They lived in houses with other radicals and looked to China as a source of inspiration and had some kind of aspiration to build a new communist party that would have a base of support among the population, as the Communist Party USA had during the 1930s. Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 met with the Black Panthers and had a close relationship. The Panthers urged white radicals to organize their own people to be anti-imperialist. Huey Newton eventually planned to merge the various nationalities into a united communist party, and this was part of his theory of intercommunalism. He argued that revolutionary organizations would be formed first on the basis of nationalities, and they would eventually unify. The Young Lords were formed among the Puerto Rican Americans, the Brown Berets among Chicanos, I War Kun among Asian Americans, etc. An organization called the Young Patriots was formed among Appalachian youth that actually used the Confederate flag as its symbol and sought to organize low-income white workers. Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 aimed to follow the Panthers' advice and sought to organize white industrial workers into a new communist party that would be aligned with the Panthers and the Vietnamese. The Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 almost immediately broke into a variety of different organizations that were aimed at party building. Mike Klonsky, the son of a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, formed the October League and traveled to China to get the official blessing of Beijing. Bob Avakian, the son of a judge in the Bay Area, formed the Revolutionary Union, which eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party. H. Bruce Franklin, a professor at Stanford University, who was fired from his tenured position for encouraging and organizing his students to engage in violent protests, briefly worked with the Revolutionary Union before forming his own organization called Venceremos. Jerry Tung, a China-born activist in New York City, led the Asian Study Group, a Marxist education circle aimed at Asian Americans and those who did not speak English. Jerry Tung went to prison briefly on charges of inciting a riot, and once he was released, his organization worked rapidly. Eventually, the Asian Study Group formed the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, a communist group that set up offices across the country. Among those who worked with them was Michio Kaku, the famous physicist. In October of 1979, the organization changed its name to the Communist Workers' Party. The Communist Workers' Party was unique in that it was a majority Asian American organization whereas most of the organizations were primarily white. Nelson Peary, an older black activist who had broken with the Communist Party, formed the Communist League, which eventually became the Communist Labor Party. The group gained significant influence in Detroit, recruiting among the labor upsurge of auto workers. A group called the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist was formed by Michael Lasky and eventually began coordinating with a British academic named Hardiel Baines, who formed a network of communist parties that eventually aligned with Albania. The well-known African-American poet and playwright Amiri Baraka, also known as Leroy Jones, changed the name of his black nationalist organization, the Congress of African People, to the Revolutionary Communist League Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong Thought in 1974. The organization maintained a presence among black radicals and eventually merged into the League for Revolutionary Struggle, Marxist-Leninist, with Chicano and Asian American organizations in 1978. The group ran black cultural centers in Newark, New Jersey, and other parts of the country. A number of smaller organizations emerged as well. A few older communists in Boston who had broken with the Communist Party in the 1950s and supported China and Albania formed Youth for Stalin and the Rayo Light Group. The Central Organization of United States Marxist-Leninists, which eventually called itself the Marxist-Leninist Party USA, came into existence. A slew of newspapers and collectives with names like Seize the Time, Sojourner Truth Organization, Revolutionary Workers League, Proletarian Unity League, Red Dawn Committee Marxist-Leninist, etc. began operating. The number of tiny pro-Beijing sects is far too numerous to count. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Workers' Party, the Communist Labor Party, the October League, which eventually was called the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, all had a few thousand members. The other organizations, which were numerous, mostly had fewer than 100 members in total, often just 5 to 10. The Guardian newspaper was the publication that functioned as the new communist movement's main forum for debate and discourse. Irwin Silber, a folk singer who had worked with Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, was the editor. Silber used The Guardian to try and unify the groups by convening forums and events featuring different organizations. The Guardian published news about what the various organizations were doing. Monthly Review was the new communist movement's academic journal and book publisher. The Guardian was subsidized by Beijing starting in 1972. According to Max Elbaum's History of the NCM, Revolution in the Air, 60s Radicals Turn to Lenin, Mao, and Che. Elbaum wrote, managing editor Jack Smith visited China. Smith was less ideologically oriented than Silber, but he was attuned to currents that might provide support to the always struggling paper. He returned with an agreement for The Guardian to sponsor tours to China, which could provide a vehicle for U.S. activists to experience the Chinese Revolution close up and simultaneously raise funds. Some estimate that as many as 2 million people may have been affiliated with the new communist movement at one time or other, based on polling conducted at the time. Others estimate the political current to be much smaller, perhaps 20,000 to 60,000. Dedicated activists. For the course of the 1970s, the NCM was a highly visible part of American life. Movies and popular culture from the time reflect how prevalent it was, despite being a fringe political element. Movies like Car Wash, Network, Switchblade Six Sisters reflect this. Every pro-union, black liberation, or anti-war protest of the 1970s included a crowd of people waving red flags and carrying pictures of Mao Zedong and chanting about the workers and the bosses. The groups clashed with each other and struggled to build a base among the population as the country and the world were rapidly changing during the 1970s. Right? In 1961, China and the Soviet Union parted ways. The initial reason for the split was Khrushchev's policies of the three peacefuls. Khrushchev had laid out a strategy of opposing the West based on peaceful coexistence between capitalist and socialist countries, peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, and peaceful economic competition between capitalist and socialist countries. The idea was that the Soviet Union would do everything possible to prevent war with the capitalist West, peaceful coexistence, and would figure out how to more effectively churn out material goods, peaceful competition. and that would eventually lead the capitalist countries to see that socialism was more efficient and gradually, one step at a time, become socialist, peaceful transition. China strongly objected to these policies, believing that colonized nations had the right to take up arms against the imperialists, that socialist countries would always struggle when faced with encirclement from the threats of the Western imperialists, and that the idea that Western countries would gradually become socialist bit by bit was utter delusion. They accused Khrushchev of being a revisionist, the term originally coined by Edward Bernstein to describe his pro-imperialist theory that capitalism was gradually turning into socialism. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. When China and Albania were economically cut off by the Soviet Union in response to their sharp critiques, China rallied its allies around the world to form new communist parties that took direction from Beijing rather than Moscow. After a few years, China launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, mobilizing the youth to bombard the headquarters and drive, quote, capitalist roaders out of the government. Lin Biao, a general in the People's Liberation Army, compiled the Little Red Book of quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. Lin Biao functioned as a leading figure of the early years of the Cultural Revolution and composed a document called Long Live the Victory of People's War, urging Mao's strategy of guerrilla warfare could be applied on a global scale. The text used similar language to Che Guevara when he called for 2-3 many Vietnams and argued that the third world was the global countryside. Lin Biao wrote, since World War II, U.S. imperialism has stepped into the shoes of German, Japanese, and Italian fascism and is trying to build a great American empire by dominating and enslaving the whole world. It is actively fostering Japanese and Western German militarism as its chief accomplices in unleashing a world war. Like a vicious world, it is bullying and enslaving various people, plundering their wealth, encroaching upon their country's sovereignty, and interfering in their internal affairs. It is the most rabid aggressor in human history, the most ferocious and common enemy of the people of the world. Every people or country in the world wants revolution, independence, and peace, but cannot direct the spearhead of its struggle against U.S. imperialism. At present, the main battlefield is the fierce struggle between the people of the world on the one side and U.S. imperialism and its lackeys on the other, the vast area of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In the world as a whole, this is the area where the people suffer the worst oppression of imperialism and where imperialist rule is the most vulnerable. Since World War II, revolutionary storms have been rising in this area, and today they have become the most important force directly plundering U.S. imperialism, or directly pounding U.S. imperialism. The contradiction between the revolutionary peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the imperialists headed by the United States is the principal contradiction in the world today. The development of this contradiction is promoting the struggle of the people of the world against U.S. imperialism and its lackeys. History has proved and will go on proving that people's war is the most effective weapon against U.S. imperialism and its lackeys. All revolutionary people will learn to wage people's war against U.S. imperialism and its lackeys. They will take up arms, learn to fight battles, and become skilled in waging people's war, though they have not done so before. U.S. imperialism is like a mad bull dashing from place to place, will finally be burned in the ashes of blazing fire of people's war that it has provoked by its own actions. Like Mao's guerrilla army seized rural areas and seized the cities, the global revolutionary movement would seize the colonized countries first of the world, and it would then surround the first world. Must be emphasized that Comrade Mao Zedong's theory of the establishment of rural revolutionary base areas and the encirclement of cities from the countryside is of outstanding, universal, impractical importance for the present revolutionary struggles of the oppressed nations and peoples, and particularly the revolutionary struggles of the oppressed nations and the peoples in Asia, Africa, and Latin America against U.S. imperialism and its lackeys. Taking the entire globe, if North America and Western Europe can be called the cities of the world, then Asia, Africa, and Latin America constitute rural areas of the world. Since World War II, the proletarian revolutionary movement has, for various reasons, been temporarily held back in North America and Western European capitalist countries, while the peoples of the revolutionary movement in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are growing vigorously. In a sense, the contemporary world revolution also presents a picture of the encirclement of the cities by rural areas. In the final analysis, the whole cause of world revolution hinges on the revolutionary struggles of Asia, Africa, and Latin American peoples who make up the overwhelming majority of the people of the world. The socialist countries should regard it as their internationalist duty to support the people's struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The text called out the Soviet Union as revisionists and betrayers of people's war. Quote, the Khrushchev revisionists have come to rescue U.S. imperialism just when it is most panic-stricken and helpless in its struggle to cope with people's war. Working hand in glove with the U.S. imperialists, they are doing their utmost to spread all kinds of arguments against people's war, and whenever they can, they are scheming to undermine it by overt and covert means. The fundamental reasons why the Khrushchev revisionists are opposed to the People's War is that they have no faith in the masses and are afraid of U.S. imperialism, afraid of war and of revolution. Like other opportunists, they are blind to the power of the masses, and they do not believe in the revolutionary people who are capable of defeating imperialism. They submit to nuclear blackmail from U.S. imperialism, and they are afraid of that. If the oppressed people and nations rise up to fight people's war with the socialist countries and repulse U.S. imperialist aggression, U.S. imperialism will become incensed, and they themselves will become involved, and their fond dreams of Soviet-U.S. cooperation to dominate the world will be spoiled. The Khrushchev revisionists insist that a nation without nuclear weapons is incapable of defeating an enemy with nuclear weapons, whatever methods of fighting it may adopt. This is tantamount to saying that anyone without nuclear weapons is destined to come to grief, destined to be bullied, and destined to be annihilated, and must either capitulate with the enemy or be confronted with his nuclear weapons, or someday come under the protection of some nuclear power and submit to its beck and call. Isn't this the law of the jungle and the survive per excellence? Isn't this helping the imperialists in their nuclear blackmail? Isn't this openly forbidding people to make revolution? February 1967 marked the climax of the first stage of the Cultural Revolution, with followers of Lin Biao seizing control of Shanghai in the famous January Storm. Shanghai was declared to be an autonomous people's commune in which direct workers' democracy reigned. Shortly afterwards, Mao Zedong criticized the move, and the People's Commune was dissolved. Zhang Shenqiao, the editor of the Communist newspaper of Shanghai, assumed leadership, arguing that mob rule and chaos were insufficient to maintain a socialist government. With the backing of Mao and his wife, Jiang Qing, the regional revolutionary committees led by the military were established as the new ruling bodies, replacing local organs of the Communist Party, but also ending chaos and mob rule. At the founding of the Beijing Municipal Revolutionary Committee, Zhang proclaimed, "Our great proletarian cultural revolution is in the high tide of the struggle of the proletarian revolutionaries to seize world power on the basis of their alliance. All-out criticism and repudiation of top party people in authority taking the country on the capitalist road is starting throughout the country. The establishment of the Beijing Municipal Revolutionary Committee at this important juncture is an immense encouragement to the proletarian revolutionaries all over the land. We are fully confident that born of the revolutionary struggle, this provisional organ of power, which is revolutionary and representative and has proletarian revolutionary authority, will be able to lead the proletarian revolutionaries of the capital forward to continue their march in the van of the battle for the great proletarian revolution in China and make still more brilliant contributions to the complete victory of the Cultural Revolution in the capital and the country as a whole. We are also fully confident that this provisional organ of power will be able to build our capital into a great school for creative study and the application of Mao Zedong thought, a capital which will never change its color, a model for which the whole country and an example for the world. Comrades in arms, we are Chairman Mao's fighters, firing at a common enemy from the same trench. While in Beijing, we, the provisional and municipal delegations, have gained much excellent experience, particularly in the new experience we have created in the process of bringing about the revolutionary Great Alliance and the revolutionary 3-in-1 combination, and your experience of establishing Conference of Representative Revolutionary Workers and Staff, Congresses of Red Guards of universities and colleges, middle schools, and conferences, and poor and lower and middle peasants." As Lin Biao moved more into the background, Zhang Shenqiao, Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, and two other individuals known as the Gang of Four became the primary voices of Chinese communism. When the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia to remove the US-backed democratic socialist who had seized power, China rolled out a new phrase, Soviet social imperialism. No longer was the Soviet Union simply revisionist. Now China was proclaiming that the USSR was another capitalist imperialist society. And the Cold War was merely an inter-imperialist rivalry. China began providing military aid and training to US-backed anti-communist fighters in Angola, who had assassinated members of the pro-Soviet Movement for the Liberation of the People of Angola, the MPLA, that fought against the Portuguese colonizers. The death of Lin Biao took place on September 13th, 1971, and the circumstances remain shrouded in mystery. It is generally understood that he attempted some kind of coup against Mao Zedong or other leading party figures, and then he fled to the Soviet Union after it failed. His plane crashed in Mongolia. After the fall of Lin Biao, the Gang of Four steered Chinese foreign policy in an increasingly pro-US direction. China proclaimed the USSR to be the main danger to the people of the world. China's Red Guard youth were deported from the cities and sent to do farm labor in the countryside. Efforts to expand China's industrial output were frequently interrupted by strikes and political mobilizations by the Gang of Four. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China in 1972 and was given a hero's welcome. They proclaimed that a third world war was inevitable. William Hinton explained the prevailing view of foreign policy in Beijing in an interview with The Guardian published in 1976. Quote, "When we asked about war, can a third world war be prevented? Thinking in China is that short of a revolution in the US and the USSR, a third world war is inevitable. The people of the world can take measures that may delay war, but as long as these two great powers, the Americans and the Russians, exist in their present form and content for dominance, war is bound to come. Détente is an illusion, a smokescreen that covers up underlying stark reality, an arms buildup leading to a war. The thinking in Beijing seems to be, in 3 to 5 years, war is unlikely. In 10 years, it is a possibility. And if one thinks in terms of 30 years, the time that has elapsed since World War II, it is likely to be sooner rather than later. Another 30 years without a world war, impossible. Does world war mean nuclear war? Not necessarily. The feeling is that a major world war might well be fought with conventional arms. Even a nuclear war will not destroy mankind. Mankind will destroy the bomb. The bomb will not destroy mankind. At least half the human race will survive. War will hasten revolution, and revolution will solve the problems that remain unsolved. Today, there is still a major contradiction between the peoples of the world and the two superpowers. As between the two superpowers, one, the Soviet Union, is more dangerous than the other. It is, in fact, the main danger confronting the people of the world. So now, a more appropriate slogan might be, mobilize the third world, unite the forces of the second world, neutralize the United States, and strike the main blow against the Soviet Union. China judges world leaders by how well they understand this new relationship of forces. Thus, they prefer Heath to Wilson, Strauss to Brandt, and Schlesinger to Kissinger. These shifting politics confused many young radicals in the United States, who were attempting to build a new communist party aligned with Beijing. For them, condemnation of the U.S. imperialist war in Vietnam had been the main aspect of their radicalization. To now follow a government that saw Nixon as an ally and the Soviet-aligned Vietnamese movement as agents of Soviet imperialism was extremely confusing. Some of the new communist movement organizations simply disregarded China's foreign policy entirely, while hailing the Cultural Revolution and celebrating China as a stronghold of socialism. When the Watergate scandal and a congressional inquiry paved the way for Nixon's resignation in 1974, the Revolutionary Union, precursor to the Revolutionary Communist Party, one of the main NCM groups, held marches on Washington to, quote, throw the bum out. Some of the rhetoric of the RU activists almost seemed to be calling for his ouster by the deep state, with speakers saying things like, Why we don't care if his helicopter crashes or if he just gets lost on the way to the John. We just want him out. When the CIA toppled the Chilean government in 1973 and oversaw the brutal slaughter of thousands of leftists, China embraced Augusto Pinochet as an ally against the main danger of Soviet social imperialism. However, many of the young China-aligned communists joined the protests in support of Salvador Allende and against the U.S. government over the coup. The October League Marxist-Leninist, which later changed its name to the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, defined itself as being the most solidly in line with Beijing in terms of foreign policy. Mike Klonsky, the chairman of the CPML, frequently traveled to China, and the group more or less had China's official backing. The Revolutionary Communist Party defined itself as being the most visible and blatantly pro-communist, convening rallies with red flags and portraits of Mao, but it often strayed from or flat out ignored Chinese foreign policy. The slew of other organizations fit somewhere in between. The groups exchanged harsh polemics against each other and often physically attacked each other. The FBI heavily infiltrated all of the groups, and this was revealed by the New York Times. Subsequent academic works revealed that Western Goals, a private intelligence service set up by members of the John Birch Society, trained members to become FBI informants inside of communist organizations. Joe Burton, an FBI informant inside the new communist movement, received a great deal of attention when he went public and then sued the FBI for violating his civil rights. Burton told the New York Times and The Guardian how he had been sent to infiltrate the communist groups and attempt to entrap members into illegal activities. Burton spread false rumors among communist groups, incited groups to attack each other, and functioned as part of a whole network of FBI informants and infiltrators that caused dysfunction and confusion among communists. Burton had established his own communist group in New Orleans called the Red Star Cadre, and he used it to establish links and sow discord among communist groups throughout the country. He said, "The Bureau got me into believing that we were looking for guns, explosives, and people who were actively blowing things up. Other countries who were infiltrating here, and groups and individuals whose ultimate goal was to overthrow our constitutional form of government. And it wouldn't be too hard for me to be antagonistic to people like that. But the truth of the matter was, after 18 months, that wasn't what we were doing. There was no reason at that time in 1972 for me not to accept what the FBI told me was true. Only after knowing these people for a while and doing monthly analysis on what we were doing, do you come to the conclusion that at no time in that period did I ever see or have reason to believe that any of these people were armed beyond the point that they could legally be armed as private citizens. And I testified to the Senate committee that there were no arms, no ammunition, no bombs, no explosives, and no money." The Guardian quoted local activists saying that they all caught on that something was off about Joe Burton, reporting nearly everyone was suspicious of him from the beginning, a longtime Tampa activist said. "It was clear to us that if he was not a cop, he was missing a paycheck. He would promote splits, distrust, and confusion." Don H. Wright, a member of the National Committee of the Revolutionary Communist Party, is revealed to have been an FBI informer who used the issue of race and his African-American background to manipulate the organization. The various sects that made up the new communist movement all more or less adopted the same strategy. They got jobs in factories and sought to win their co-workers to communism. They adopted their own interpretations of how to carry out the methods spelled out in the J. Peters Manual on Organization, published by the Communist Party in the 1930s. They formed shop nuclei. They published specific newsletters for their workplaces. They tried to divide their co-workers into the advanced, the center, and the right, and strategized how to recruit the advanced, neutralize the center, and defeat the right. The only city where the new communist movement seems to have been highly successful in gaining influence among industrial workers was Detroit. Motor City in Michigan was overwhelmingly African American and a center of automobile manufacturing. A communist magazine called Inner City Voice was published throughout the city after the 1968 riots. The FBI worked to stop the magazine from being published. The book Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, written by Dan Drzakis and Marvin Sukin, describes the FBI made a practice of visiting shops which produced the paper and inquiring why the owners were supporting subversion. The usual result was an immediate refusal to print any more issues. As a result of the FBI and the union harassment, the Inner City Voice never printed in the same shop twice. The consequence of the double attack was that copy had to be taken to Chicago. The papers were then trucked back to Detroit for distribution. Kenneth Cockrell, an African-American attorney who identified as a communist, became a hero to the Black community for two major courtroom acquittals he secured. The first victory was for a group of Black nationalists from the Republic of New Africa organization who had assassinated some local heroin dealers and then gotten into a shootout with the police who had been protecting them. The second was for Jimmy Johnson, a Black auto worker who murdered his white co-workers after he was wrongfully terminated. The publishers of Inner City Voice, including Ken Cockrell and General Baker, formed the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as a group of Black communist activists operating in the city. The Motor City Labor League was established for their white allies. Ken Cockrell and his allies at Wayne State University eventually seized control of South End, the campus newspaper, and transformed it into a communist publication with the slogan, "One class-conscious worker is worth 100 students," printed on the masthead. The South End was distributed by Mike Hamlin and Luke Tripp, two members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and they battled the university in court to maintain control of the publication and funds and use it to promote communism throughout the city. Soon, Black auto workers were organized into a faction called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, DRUM, which accused the UAW leadership of being racist and pro-imperialist and aimed to transform the Auto Workers Union into a communist one, aligned with China and the Black Panthers. DRUM members protested outside the headquarters of the UAW, chanting, "We finally got the news about how our dues are being used. We finally got the news about how our dues are being used." The summer of 1973 was known as Wildcat Summer in Detroit auto plants, as major industrial actions led by communists dominated local headlines. On July 24th, two Black auto workers who had previously been members of the Black Panthers seized control of the electrical power cage at their factory. 214 of the 300 workers at the plant had demanded that a supervisor, known for his racist comments and actions, be fired. When the company refused to listen to them, Larry Carter and Isaac Shorter went into the electrical cage and turned off the power in the factory, shutting down the assembly line. Hundreds of workers from nearby factories joined them as they barricaded themselves into the electrical cage, refusing to come out unless the racist boss was fired and they were granted immunity for their actions. After 13 hours, the company gave in. Workers carried Carter and Shorter out of the factory on their shoulders, cheering. This is an image of them being carried out victorious on the shoulders of their co-workers. The Black workers in the city could control it. Isaac Shorter told the press, "The Black workers in this city could control it. But at the same time, there's no such thing as Black control, because it's not a racial thing. It's a system which is a capitalist system. It oppresses all of us, Blacks, whites, Chicanos, just name it, yellow and brown. And that's the way we should look at it as being." On August 28th, another factory was shut down by a wildcat strike when 16 workers were fired for reporting health and safety violations. This strike was primarily made up of white workers, though their leader and spokesperson was Jerome Scott, an African-American worker who was part of the Communist League led by Nelson Peary. The local UAW boss, Doug Frazier, went to the factory the next day and urged the workers outside with picket signs to return to work, but they did not listen. After 6 days, the company gave in and agreed to address health and safety violations and rehire the workers who were wrongfully fired. The very next day, another factory was shut down by William Gilbreth, a leader of the Progressive Labor Party. He had been fired for handing out leaflets about bad conditions on the job. He returned to work for his normal shift after being fired and sat down on top of the assembly line, bringing production to a halt. 200 workers joined him in occupying the plant for a sit-down strike. The police stormed into the plant and arrested 15 workers and cleared out the strikers. The next day, workers at the factory who wanted to continue the strike had a pitched battle with a mob of more conservative workers mobilized by the UAW leadership to break this, quote, illegal strike. In 1972, a communist named Justin C. Ravitz, who had worked closely with Kenneth Cockrell, was elected for a 10-year term as a local judge. He quoted Mao Zedong's Red Book from the bench, and he fined food corporations for serving rotten meat to the public. And he forced rapists to study communist literature on the oppression of women before their sentencing. Ravitz removed the U.S. flag from the courtroom and engaged in other provocative activities from his elected seat on the bench, quoting Marx and Lenin in speeches to the court and using his position to promote communist politics. In 1973, Coleman Young was elected mayor of Detroit on a platform of abolishing a particularly vicious wing of the police department known for brutality. At the time he was elected, Coleman Young was very friendly with both the Communist Party USA and a number of NCM and Trotskyite groups. He stayed in office until 1994, though his politics often shifted and were not consistently radical. Abayomi Azikiwe, founder of the Pan-African Newswire, described the pivotal mayor, quote, Detroit's first African-American mayor, Coleman A. Young, who governed from 1974 to 1993, built his political reputation through grassroots involvement as a left-wing trade union organizer with the National Negro Labor Councils during the 1940s and early 50s. Young was brought in before the Legislative Committee on Un-American Activities during the 1950s. He stood up to right-wing congressional members challenging their racist remarks and refusing to answer questions related to his membership and ties with the communist left. In 1973, Young, with the support of a broad alliance of African-American political forces, along with progressive and liberal whites, became the first black mayor of Detroit. He immediately set out to rid the city of racist cops and other municipal employees, instituting an affirmative action program that was challenged by law enforcement and other reactionary political forces. However, compromises were necessary to maintain capitalist investments in Detroit. At the close of the Young administration, the city was suffering from massive job losses and an inadequate and declining public transportation system and the collapse of municipal infrastructure. General Baker, a black auto worker and founder of Drum, eventually became a member of the Communist Labor Party and ran for a Detroit seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1976. In an article published by his campaign, he wrote, despite lies and propaganda on television, in the schools, and in the newspaper, the people cannot be fooled about socialism any longer. They have learned that this capitalist system is the most savage, barbaric system in the history of the world. With the capacity to feed the entire world, there has never been such starvation. With the possibility for peace, there has never been such bloodshed. With the need of housing and school never greater, never has there been such unemployment. Capitalism is a system that depends that honest working people bow down and take orders from common criminals. This is what must change, and that is what this campaign is about. The goal of this campaign is to imbue the people of the United States of North America with the burning desire and will to fight for socialism, because the socialist system means real freedom. It means a job, because without a job, there is no food, shelter, and clothing, and without food, shelter, and clothing, there is no life. It means getting up in the morning and knowing that the battery is going to be in your car so you can drive to work. It means coming home at night and knowing your television is going to be there, because once people are capable of living without stealing from their neighbors, stealing will stop. It means living in a friendly town where national hatred has ended and people are no longer afraid of one another because of the color of their skin or the language that they speak. This can only come with socialism. The working class must end this capitalist system that is based and thrives upon murder, starvation, and misery of the masses of the people. There is no need of a system that can only produce want and hunger for the many and vast wealth for the few. That system must be swept away, and the working class can do it. Ezekwe noted that starting in the 1970s, auto plants and factories in Detroit began closing because the city was known for its militant atmosphere among the workers. Since the 1970s, the owners of capital have strategically relocated outside the region into the areas where the higher rate of profit could be accrued through the super exploitation of labor. If one word had to be chosen to characterize the culture of the new communist movement, it would be intense, writes Max Elbaum. The sheer amount of time, passion, and energy that made movement cadre through into political work made the movement all life consuming. Today, it is fashionable to attribute such single-mindedness to ideological, to some combination of top-down structures, ideological brainwashing, and psychological aberration. But the willingness, indeed the eagerness, of young Marxist-Leninists to devote most of their waking hours to revolutionary activity was not the result of manipulation, orders from above, or unmet emotional needs. It was the expression of deeply held convictions. Even at the height of the late 60s radicalism, it was no casual, risk-free decision to declare oneself to be a communist. The various NCM groups took their mission very seriously. They aimed to set up a new communist organization among the working class. They often lived together and tried to have total devotion to the cause. They practiced criticism, self-criticism, utilizing this to hold each other accountable and demand people give their utmost to the cause. There was a strong understanding on the part of most NCM groups that they did not want to be part of the counterculture or the fringe elements of U.S. society. However, being a communist in America during the Cold War relegated one to the political fringe, as communism was the country's declared enemy. The NCM's stated goal was to build a base among the population, and it sought to maneuver in various ways to accomplish this task. In 1974, the city of Boston implemented a program of school busing in order to racially desegregate the city. Children were bused to random schools rather than the one closest to them, in the hopes of breaking down inequality between schools in black and white neighborhoods. The working class white Irish Americans of Boston were vehemently opposed to the program, and ugly racist riots soon erupted. Black nationalists, such as the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers, also opposed school integration. The busing question forced many communist groups into an awkward position. Some defended busing, some highlighted the voices of black radicals who opposed it, and some embraced the racist riots. The headline of the Revolutionary Union's newspaper proclaimed, "The people must unite to smash the Boston busing plan." The text Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, by Aaron J. Leonard and Conrad A. Gallagher, quotes the article the RU published justifying their support for the anti-busing riots. Quote, "Those who think the way to stand with black people and other oppressed nationalities is to attack white workers as simply a bunch of racists who think the ruling class is a friend of the oppressed can at best only drag the tail of the struggle, and if they continue in this path, can only end up falling over backwards completely into the camp of the ruling class." The RU eventually apologized and became the bad example of a communist group that had embraced the right wing. The wisdom that supporting the right wing was an unforgivable crime spread. Workers' World Party prided itself on organizing a We Say No to Racism rally against the racist riots in 1974 that attracted 20,000 people. Max Elbaum writes, quote, "The RU dug in its heels, but for the first time faced not just criticism, but complete isolation. The Revolutionary Union founded the Revolutionary Communist Party in 1975, and at the time was going to great lengths to break with the counterculture and left aesthetics. Members wore jean jackets and baseball caps with the names of beer companies, a kind of caricature of what they thought working class people were like." Elbaum writes, outside of its own milieu, however, RCP had become a near pariah. Between the fall of 1974 and the fall of 1975, the view shifted from having criticism of the RU to seeing it as an outside of Marxism-Leninism altogether. During this time, the RCP seized control of Vietnam veterans against the war. According to Elbaum, the RU controlled the national office and moved decisively to assert full control over the organization. It expelled a number of chapters, drove out scores of individuals, and imposed pragmatic uniformity on those members who remained. Despite being increasingly isolated from the movement, the Revolutionary Communist Party was much larger than other communist NCM groups. The Weather Underground had been continuously bombing symbolic sites such as the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and the offices of elected officials. The group generally called in a threat prior to the explosive detonating in order to make sure no one was killed. After a while, Weatherman bombings began receiving less and less publicity and attention. As a result, the organization began debating how to move forward and decided it was time for a dramatic public relations move. The organization published a book called Prairie Fire, The Politics of Anti-Imperialism in 1974 and distributed 40,000 copies all across the country. Stacks of this book were discreetly left on college campuses, inside of bookstores, and in various places where the Weathermen believed potential sympathizers would find them. The book was intended to explain the justification for the various bombings the organization was carrying out and raise the organization's notoriety in the face of decreased media attention. The primary author of the book was probably Clayton Van Lydegraaf, an older veteran of the Communist Party who had coordinated U.S. support for the Chinese military during the Second World War and had deep intelligence connections. Lydegraaf more or less moved into the position of being the Weather Underground's ideological guru, despite being a kind of man of violence rather than a Marxist theoretician, if one looks over his life story. Lydegraaf had joined the Communist Party as a teenager during the strike waves of the 1930s and joined the U.S. military during the Second World War, where he established close ties with the Chinese Red Army, arranging U.S. arms and supply shipments to help fight Japan. Lydegraaf returned to the U.S. and was an active member of the Communist Party, running for office, getting kicked out of his union, and otherwise making headlines as a communist activist in the Pacific Northwest region. Then, during the height of McCarthyism and the prosecutions of communists, he disappeared. According to a biographical article on historylink.org, in 1955, Van Lydegraaf's wife, Mary Ann, and her father were accused of being Communist Party members. She said in related court proceedings that she was estranged from her husband, who had vanished 4 years before in 1951, and she had no idea where he was. She filed for divorce in July of 1955. Van Lydegraaf resurfaced in 1956. In February of that year, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of Soviet Russia, gave a secret speech to Communist Party leaders in which he denounced Stalin. Van Lydegraaf did not approve of Khrushchev's renunciation of Stalin, and his CPUSA career came to an end. It's unclear whether he left the party or whether he was expelled for following the Stalinist line. It then appears during his years of disappearance, Lydegraaf had been in Asia, and this came up when he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1956. A committee lawyer accused him of being a trained killer and saboteur who had been part of a peasant guerrilla uprising in the Philippines right after World War II. He demanded to know if Van Lydegraaf had ever killed anyone using a garrote, a thin wire used to strangle people silently, and came right out and accused him of murder. Van Lydegraaf, a short, stocky man in a dark suit, gazed up at the ceiling with an amused expression and refused to answer questions, invoking the Fifth Amendment, although he did testify to having joined the Communist Party in 1933. He told reporters in the hall afterwards that the accusations were pure poppycock and that he'd never been to the Philippines. Regardless, Lydegraaf floated around anti-revisionist and pro-Beijing circles throughout the 1960s. He wrote a few pamphlets, such as The Object is to Win, that were widely circulated before he eventually joined the Weather Underground in the 1970s. He supported himself as a refrigerator repairman and engaged in clandestine activities such as planting bombs and breaking drug guru Timothy Leary out of federal prison. He eventually left the illegal and clandestine wing of the Weather Underground, and he formed the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee as the public above-ground organization that aimed to generate public support for their activities after the Prairie Fire book was distributed across the country. The above-ground organization raised money for the Weathermen and helped them make connections with the Black Liberation Army and other left adventurist organizations engaged in illegal activities. From January 30th to February 1st of 1976, the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee organized the National Hard Times Conference, which served as a gathering of many NCM activists and related organizations. The October League, Marxist-Leninist, the Black Panthers, the Guardian newspaper, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, the Workers' World Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party, and many other small sects gathered for a few days to debate. A few days of debate, fiery speeches, and workshops. Elbaum writes, over 2,000 people turned out, but the conference suffered from an extreme lack of focus, at some points bordering on utter disarray, and it did not meet its goal of setting up an ongoing coalition. In 1976, the United States celebrated its bicentennial with a mass patriotic parade in Philadelphia to honor the Declaration of Independence. The Revolutionary Communist Party countered the bicentennial with months of provocative actions leading up to a large rally on July 4th. The slogan they used was, "We've carried the rich for 200 years, now let's get them off our backs." Vietnam Veterans Against the War, led by RCP members, raised the slogan, "We won't fight another rich man's war." RCP activists seized the Statue of Liberty and unfurled huge banners with both slogans from it. 5,000 people joined the RCP in the streets of Philadelphia for their July 4th event. A photograph of the rally's veterans contingent has become iconic. And these are photos from that rally. We won't fight another rich man's war, right? We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's get them off our backs, right? The various other organizations that had attended the National Hard Times Conference convened a much larger rally called Bicentennial Without Colonies, which focused on independence for Puerto Rico and highlighted the Black Panthers. The largest presence among the crowd came from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, a Marxist-Leninist organization that advocated the independence of Puerto Rico and denounced U.S. imperialism. The PSP was at the height of its influence in Puerto Rico and among the North American Puerto Rican diaspora, modeling itself on the Black Panthers. Native Americans, aligned with the American Indian movement, bussed in from various reservations. The crowd was estimated by the New York Times to be about 30,000 to 40,000 strong. A large contingent of Black Panthers led the march, chanting, "Black power to Black people, Puerto Rican power to Puerto Rican people, red power to red people, pick up the gun, pick up the gun." The two rallies were both led by pro-Beijing communists, but they had distinctly opposite focuses. The RCP's "We've carried the rich for 200 years, now let's get them off our backs" rally focused on economics and class struggle and very much wanted to break out of the movement and build their own organization. The RCP went it alone, doing their own rally and using it to spread a specifically communist message. The Bicentennial Without Colonies focused on race and viewing the USA as an illegitimate settler colony. The larger rally's message was not very clear, but it was very much a movement gathering of different minority groups led by Prairie Fire and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, but also including Trotskyites, a wide range of NCM factions, anarchists, pacifists, and the bulk of the standard left, denouncing the USA as a racist country on its 200-year anniversary. It's worth noting that both rallies happened on the same day, July 4th, 1976, in different parts of the city. One rally, Bicentennial Without Colonies, was far bigger, but the smaller rally, "We've carried the rich for 200 years, got much more attention, and years later, much more information about it can be found. The bigger rally was a collection of different leftist trends, identity politics groupings, negotiating with each other for time on a stage, highlighting their various pet issues, and fruitlessly trying to build some kind of coalition. The other rally was aimed at communicating a coherent class struggle, anti-imperialist message in a way that the U.S. public could easily understand. The RCP's rally had a disproportionately larger impact despite its smaller size, and shows a much more effective approach. The organizers of Bicentennial Without Colonies were aiming to hold together a fringe, isolated movement. The RCP aspired to lead the working class to revolution. In 1977, the New York Times raised the alarm about the growing influence of the Revolutionary Communist Party among West Virginia's coal miners through its Miners' Right to Strike Committee. The organization had begun in 1974 in opposition to gas rationing imposed on West Virginia during the energy crisis. One wildcat strike organized by RCP members in 1975 had gone on for 8 weeks and involved 50,000 workers who demanded a change in union grievance procedures. RCP member and Vietnam veteran Louis Skip Delano was briefly sent to federal prison for violating court injunctions. According to heavy radicals, the judge cited Delano's political beliefs as making him a danger to the industry and to the United Mine Workers. Outside of Detroit and a few other parts of the country, the new communist movement largely failed to build a base of support among the population. Most of the U.S. public, especially white Americans, viewed communism as evil, anti-Christian, and totalitarian. The new communist movement groups worked hard not to appear like counterculture hippies. Many of the NCM groups required their male members to have short hair, and in some cases, their female members to wear only dresses and not pants. The groups forbid drug use and often proclaimed homosexuality to be bourgeois decadence. Regardless of how much the NCM activists tried to break with counterculture aesthetics, they remained fringe. With a few exceptional breakthroughs, such as the Detroit auto plants and the West Virginia coal fields, the NCM only seemed to recruit in marginal spaces, such as college campuses and prisons. The American industrial workers had high wages and comfortable lives, and they did not want to join a revolution. The idea that the bulk of Americans were irredeemable racists who benefited from imperialism became a common and popular response to the NCM's failures. Noel Ignatin coined the term white skin privilege as a way of explaining why white industrial workers did not stand in solidarity with their black co-workers. A book called Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, was published in the early 1980s by a person identified as Jay Sakai, who claimed to have been an NCM activist who became disillusioned with the potential of the white working class. The Weather Underground had more or less always believed the bulk of the American workers were irredeemable racists, with a kind of brief reprieve from this kind of thinking during the 1976 Hard Times Conference. In 1977, Clayton Van Lydegraaf went head-to-head with other leaders of the Weather Underground. As the group came to terms with its irrelevance as an illegal organization that set off occasional bombs, internal fighting got ugly. Lydegraaf circulated an audio recording of Bernadine Dorn crying as she read out a confession and apology for racism, crimes against the people of the world, and trying to wreck the women's movement. In the tape, she also denounced her husband, Bill Ayers, and other prominent leaders of the organization. After getting pretty badly burned in the internal fighting, Mark Rudd turned himself in to the FBI in September of 1977. At the time, his father told the media, "You get a little bit too old to be a revolutionary." That same year, Lydegraaf and 4 others walked away from the Weatherman to form the Revolutionary Committee. The FBI, which had been closely monitoring them for several years, arrested them in November of 1977 in order to prevent them from blowing up the home of a California state senator. The group of 5 people that had broken away from the Weather Underground apparently had planned a string of bombings to make a name for themselves and their new organization. They took a plea deal and they served 2 years in prison. San Francisco, which had been a center of the 1960s counterculture, was a stronghold of the new communist movement organizations throughout the early 1970s. The various sects battled each other in the streets in an atmosphere that was much darker and more pessimistic than the idealism of the 1960s upsurge. The role of the FBI in playing various communist factions against each other is pretty well established. Two Trotskyite groups, the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the Spartacist League, both gained a reputation for engaging in violence against other organizations, but they were far from alone in this practice. Many Maoist and anarchist sects existed simply to expose, torment, threaten, attack, and harass other radical organizations. Ramparts suddenly disappeared without warning in 1975. The publication had been a staple of communist and radical politics, not just regionally, but nationally. The magazine had been sued in 1972 by the Pacific Bell Telephone Company for publishing copyrighted technological information in an article about how to prevent one's phone from being tapped by law enforcement. The magazine had become more and more focused on sexual matters in the early 70s, giving a lot of attention to the gay rights movement, feminism, and content related to personal advice about sex. San Francisco had also become a center of the gay rights movement. Among the organizations that operated in San Francisco was the Democratic Workers' Party, headed by Marlene Dixon. This was a communist organization that emphasized feminism and gay rights and functioned in a semi-clandestine manner. It had a presence mainly on the West Coast. In 1974, George Moscone was elected mayor. He won against rival Democrat Dianne Feinstein, who viewed him as being too far left. Moscone was a social democratic figure who drew support from labor unions and some NCM, New Communist Movement activist groups, though most did not back him, seeing him as a liberal reformist. Moscone aligned himself with the gay rights movement and the first openly gay elected official, City Alderman Harvey Milk. Both Milk and Moscone received massive support from a strange pro-communist religious sect called the People's Temple. People's Temple was led by Reverend Jim Jones, a Pentecostal minister who led a mostly black congregation and proclaimed himself to be the combined reincarnation of Jesus and Lenin. Jim Jones was a personal friend of Communist Party leader Angela Davis and had frequently preached sermons praising the Soviet Union and China. Jones staged faith healings and miracles and claimed he was a prophet sent to earth to announce the death of God and free humanity from the, quote, sky god and usher in heaven on earth. Moscone appointed Reverend Jones to be the head of the city's housing board. Soon, deeply disturbing revelations about the internal activities of the People's Temple surfaced. In response, Jones began moving his flock to Guyana, where he established a socialistic agricultural commune. November 18, 1978 was the date of the infamous Jonestown mass suicide, when Jones and over 900 of his followers drank cyanide or were shot. The incident, known as the Jonestown mass suicide, horrified the world afterward, and on November 27th, George Moscone and Harvey Milk were assassinated inside of San Francisco's City Hall. The shooter, former police officer Dan White, received only a 2-year sentence, invoking the infamous Twinkie defense. San Francisco was gripped by the infamous White Night riots among the gay community, and Dianne Feinstein became the new mayor. The tragic events of late 1978 seemed to be setting the stage for much wilder events in the coming year. It's worth noting that the Jonestown incident intensified the cult scare of the late 1970s, spawned by the rise of new religious movements. Ted Patrick and his associates formed an organization called the Cult Awareness Network that engaged in the practice of kidnapping people when their relatives felt they had been brainwashed by a cult. Deprogrammers would hold people against their will and attempt to change their religious beliefs, charging their family members thousands of dollars for the service. The Unification Church, an anti-communist religious organization from South Korea, was rising in prominence during these years as well. The group presented itself as a peace movement and used the language that sounded similar to 1960s countercultural groups, but was aligned with the hard right-wing World Anti-Communist League based on the island of Taiwan. The Unification Church recruited college-age students to engage in anti-communist activism through its campus activist group, CARP, Collegiate Association for Research of Principles, and its larger anti-communist group, Causa International. The Carter administration launched a series of investigations into the organization as being an alleged front for South Korean intelligence as part of the Koreagate scandal. None of these charges could be proven. The group's leader, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, was eventually imprisoned for tax violations, with many speaking up against the prosecutions, including left-wing voices such as Minister Louis Farrakhan and civil rights leader James Bevel. The primary targets of the Cult Awareness Network were religious groups, but communist groups were not spared. It was not uncommon during the late 70s and early 80s for a college-age student to become a communist and then their parents to hire kidnappers to forcibly abduct them and browbeat them into renouncing Marxist politics. Some communist groups, such as the Democratic Workers' Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party, seem to have been more singled out for harassment by the anti-cult movement than others. Eventually, Ted Patrick went to prison, and the Cult Awareness Network was sued out of existence for violating the religious freedom of many legal adults that it had kidnapped. Steve Hassan, one of the primary leaders of the Cult Awareness Network, who used his brief involvement with the Unification Church as the basis for his expertise, supposedly on cults, remains widely promoted in U.S. media. He regularly appears on CNN, and his book, The Cult of Trump, was widely promoted in U.S. media. Hassan functions as a background advisor to prominent socialist breadtube personalities such as Vosh, ContraPoints, and H-Bomber Guy. A number of reports claiming to show KGB involvement with the Cult Awareness Network have been circulated, but reports also indicate the involvement of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies in their activities as well. The various religious and political groups operating in the United States during these years were often seen as potential pawns in intelligence schemes and had different covert forces seeking to manipulate their behavior and to nudge them in different directions. The economic downturn of 1978 had many new communist movement activists convinced that their decade of unsuccessful work in the factories would soon pay off. The 1976 Hard Times Conference had used the slogan, "Hard times are fighting times," and anticipated that the militancy of the Great Depression would return to the U.S. working class in response to economic hardship. However, among the bulk of the white working class, the opposite was the case. The U.S. living standards had been consistently rising since the end of the Second World War. The response of most U.S. workers to the sudden downturn was to become more conservative and to blame liberal reforms. As the so-called Reagan Revolution set in, the NCM activists moved in tragic desperation. The death of Mao Zedong and the rise of Deng Xiaoping also confused them. China had already confused them with its pro-U.S. foreign policy. When Deng Xiaoping arrested the Gang of Four and declared the Cultural Revolution to have been a mistake, many NCM groups denounced China outright. The Communist Party Marxist-Leninists solidly backed Deng Xiaoping and embraced the new leadership in Beijing, only to be told a few years later that China no longer wanted a relationship with U.S. communist organizations. The CPML dissolved, with members fighting over what to do next and going in various directions. The Revolutionary Communist Party split in 1978, with China being a central point of debate. Those who remained loyal to Bob Avakian denounced China as having restored capitalism. Those who split seemed to maintain some support for China, or at least distance themselves from the Gang of Four. Those who left the RCP called themselves the Revolutionary Workers' Headquarters, and fistfights between the two factions took place across the country for several years. Avakian expelled every member of the RCP except for his trusted inner circle, and he forced anyone who wished to rejoin the RCP to reapply for membership and clearly demonstrate their loyalty. The new RCP functioned in a much more clandestine and secretive manner. Literature, such as Red Papers 8, published by those who resigned or were expelled, indicates that internal issues and debates about strategy played a much larger part in the split than merely disagreements about China's new leadership. Label Bergman, a veteran of the Communist Party who had been Avakian's personal mentor, joined with Mickey Jarvis and a number of others to form the Revolutionary Workers Headquarters. The RWH attacked Avakian personally on issues related to his mental health and alleged that the organization was becoming a cult of personality around him and not aimed at building a base among the working class. They wrote, Avakian's brand of political instability increasingly caused the RCP to deviate from the task of joining the working class struggle as emphasized at the founding Congress. For Avakian, the easier and therefore more important task was to keep his work on the level of rational knowledge so he could play the potential role that was best suited for a man of his mental ability and stature in the party, not to mention his personal state of mind. Avakian couldn't lead the RCP to deepen and develop its line because his line no longer leaps beyond rational knowledge back into revolutionary practice. In our party, there are two lines and two headquarters. Avakian is convinced that without his genius, there can be no real party in the U.S. Idealists are never bothered by the questions reality poses. Avakian decried much of the RCP's activism as economism and began orienting toward more adventurous street confrontations, much like the SDS Weatherman he had once opposed. Avakian wrote, to make such a rupture with economism was very revivifying and very liberating for me and our party as a whole. Our whole practice changed enormously. In one section of his autobiography, Avakian references a revelation that he had at a Jimmy Buffett concert. As the struggle with the Mensheviks, Mickey Jarvis, Label Bergman, and others, was developing, I went to a Jimmy Buffett concert. There was a certain rebellious edge, and it made me think, we've gotten into tailing after the more immediate sections of the workers, but there are workers, including the white workers, who are more alienated and more rebellious than many of the more stable and conservative-tending workers, among whom had been focusing much of our work. In a way, this Jimmy Buffett concert was part of provoking questions in my mind politically and ideologically. When the embassy of the People's Republic of China opened in Washington, D.C. in 1979, RCP members trashed it, smashing windows, spray painting pro-Mao and anti-Deng slogans on it, and throwing small explosives. In the following days, the RCP organized a Death to Deng Xiaoping rally outside the White House when Deng met with Carter. Two RCP members, enabled by the U.S. Air Force and Secret Service, infiltrated White House grounds and disrupted Deng's press conference with Carter. Avakian and 200 other members of the RCP were arrested and hit with heavy criminal charges. At the time, the RCP was heavily infiltrated by an entity called Western Goals, an intelligence service staffed by members of the John Birch Society that worked with the FBI to track communist organizations. The FBI and the John Birch Society opposed Carter normalizing relations with China, seeing China as a communist-led country that they blamed for the global heroin trade. The RCP, it appears, was being used by deep state elements to work against Carter and the formal establishment of U.S.-China relations. And at the same time, the RCP published a fake issue of the October League's newspaper, The Call, in which they baited the group for its pro-Beijing stance and its support for gay rights. The Los Angeles Times also misquoted Avakian as threatening the life of Jimmy Carter, leading to a lengthy Secret Service investigation into the RCP and its activities. When the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized, the RCP positioned itself as taking the pro-Khomeini stance. RCP members went to right-wing rallies condemning Iran and provoking right-wing crowds to attack them. Many RCP members were injured or arrested during these provocative actions. In early 1980, the RCP launched a campaign for a general strike on May 1st, dubbed May Day 1980. From January to May of 1980, RCP members across the country got into scuffles with police and random working class people, with hundreds of arrests taking place. RCP member Damian Garcia ripped down the U.S. flag at the Alamo in Texas and replaced it with a communist flag. He was murdered in Los Angeles several days later. The dead body of another RCP activist in New York City was found at the bottom of an elevator shaft. On May 1st, 1980, RCP activists Steve Yip and Glenn Gann poured red paint on the U.S. and Soviet ambassadors at the United Nations and shouted, "Down with U.S.-Soviet war moves." They were both sent to prison for several years for attacking a foreign diplomat. Avakian eventually relocated to Paris in 1982 and applied for political exile status. The French government denied him official status as a political exile, but allowed him to remain in the country under undisclosed terms. He led the RCP from France and did not return to the United States until 2003. November 3rd, 1979 was the date of the Greensboro Massacre. Members of the Communist Workers' Party in North Carolina held a Death to the Klan rally and sent the KKK a threatening letter challenging them to, quote, show their faces. The KKK responded by coming to the rally and shooting and killing 5 people. The Klansmen were acquitted in court. Among their car caravan were multiple FBI informants and an undercover agent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The Communist Workers' Party held very provocative protests against the Democratic National Convention in New York City when Jimmy Carter refused to bring federal charges against the Klansmen who murdered their comrades. The CWP members broke into restaurants where Democrats were eating near the convention site, shouting, "Carter, Kennedy, you can't hide. We know you're on the Klan side." They also disrupted Jimmy Carter's acceptance speech. The New York Times reports, a few minutes into the president's speech, a sharp staccato burst out, like that of firecrackers, was heard in the area of the president's right. It appeared they seized a woman who had apparently set off a string of firecrackers. Another woman in the balcony section began screaming and shouting. She was later identified as the widow as Dale Sampson, the widow of William Sampson, who was killed in Greensboro, North Carolina, last December 3rd in a march by the Communist Workers' Party. Fraser Glenn Miller, one of the Klansmen who participated in the caravan in Greensboro, North Carolina, eventually shot up a Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas, decades later in April of 2014, killing 3 people. At his trial, it was revealed that Miller had spent most of his life living under the protection of the FBI and the Federal Witness Protection Program. The remaining leaders of the Weather Underground, Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, formally surrendered in 1980. Most of the charges were dropped by the U.S. Department of Justice due to the extreme misconduct the FBI had engaged in while investigating them. Bernardine Dohrn eventually went to prison for 7 months for contempt when she refused to testify against other members to a grand jury. The members of the Weather Underground who refused to surrender with the rest of the group called themselves the May 19th Communist Organization. They conducted a series of bombings, prison breaks, and armed robberies throughout the early 1980s, often coordinating with the Black Liberation Army. By 1985, almost all the organization's members had been arrested or imprisoned. The early 1980s marked a significant moment in the history of American communism that can be rightly called the Great Retreat. In the aftermath of a decade of work that showed little progress, China's political shifts, and the right-wing turn in American politics, many people turned away from Marxism-Leninism altogether, and those who remained communists abandoned approaching the broad masses of people. A key factor in moving people away from communist politics was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which formally became the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. The fact that many NCM organizations began to dissolve in the late 70s and early 80s created an opening for Michael Harrington, one of the State Department socialists of the Lyndon Johnson administration, who'd been mentored by the Trotskyist Max Shachtman, to win over confused and demoralized people with an anti-capitalist orientation. Many of the organization's top leaders had very open and direct ties to U.S. intelligence. Irving Howe had been one of the leading academics promoted by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. with his work published in Partisan Review magazine. He was frequently featured by mainstream publications like the New York Times Book Review as a Marxist who condemned anti-imperialists. Gloria Steinem, the leading feminist voice in America, was also a founding board member of DSA. She openly brags about her relationship with the CIA that started in the early 1960s when she infiltrated communist youth festivals. Amid all the confusion as various NCM groups dissolved or split, a well-funded publication called In These Times, staffed by members of DSA, was circulated and made arguments using Marxist language that trying to form a communist organization in the United States was pointless. Max Elbaum points out, DSA began with more than 30 chapters that had at least a small activist core, and the organization was able to maintain a presence in several grassroots movements, as well as participate in the post-1980s ferment within the progressive wing of the Democrat Party. The formation of DSA established social democracy as the dominant trend on the U.S. socialist left. With lots of funding and a soft approach, the DSA organizers would de-radicalize new communist movement members and woo them into mainstream Democratic Party politics or to lives as harmless academics, no longer seeking to build a revolutionary organization. The rising star of DSA was Bernie Sanders, who began ascending in local politics in Vermont. Many NCM radicals had already turned against the Soviet Union and the various anti-imperialist movements that were aligned with it because of China's denunciation of Soviet social imperialism. Getting these activists to go a bit further and denounce Marxism-Leninism altogether in favor of some kind of egalitarian vision of democratic socialism wasn't very difficult, especially as the global communist movement seemed to be in decline. Doug Frazier of the United Auto Workers began holding conferences under the name of an organization called Progressive Alliance that was funded by UAW money. And the forces that launched DSA had been cooperating with him for some time. After Reagan infamously invoked the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law to break the PATCO strike of air traffic controllers in August of 1981, the AFL-CIO saw a threat and called a national demonstration of labor unions called Solidarity Day on September 19th. The rally involved 400,000 labor union members, but Max Elbaum notes that the influence of communists on the day's events was minimal. The remnants of the party-building movement, along with the rest of the left, exerted no influence on the action's demands or strategy. Left participation was essentially limited to helping bring co-workers to the action and distributing literature to those who attended. Harold Washington's campaign for mayor of Chicago in 1983 and Jesse Jackson's campaign for president in 1984 attracted many communists and former communists, and this got them closer to Michael Harrington and his associates, who argued that electoral politics and building a socialist faction of the Democratic Party was the way forward. Jesse Jackson included Amiri Baraka and his League of Revolutionary Struggle in the Rainbow Push coalition that he created for his campaign that focused on Black community issues. Many other NCM organizations went into Jesse Jackson's campaign in 1984 as their membership and influence was dwindling. Though through the Jackson campaign, many NCM activists shed their communist politics and joined DSA or just became regular Democrats. The Communist Workers' Party politically shifted in different directions during the 1980s. The group developed a very close tie to the Workers' World Party, with Sam Marcy and Jerry Tung becoming close friends. The two organizations co-sponsored the People's Anti-War Mobilization protest in 1980. Jerry Tung published a book, The Socialist Road, the same year, basically articulating a worldview similar to Sam Marcy's global class war theory. The book said that the USSR and China were both socialist, but led by a, quote, revisionist bureaucracy. However, the Communist Workers' Party and the Workers' World Party sharply differed on the issue of gay rights. The Communist Workers' Party felt that homosexuality was, quote, a form of social sickness, a form of social perversion. It is a form of bourgeois ideology which appeals to the petty bourgeoisie because of its appearance as sexual freedom. Workers' World Party was increasingly identified with the gay rights movement. In addition, Workers' World Party did not regulate the sex lives of its members. And when Jerry Tung became aware of Workers' World Party members having extramarital affairs with members of his organization, he was horrified. When Marcy clarified that he had no intention of regulating the sexual behavior of consenting adults within his organization, the talk of merging and the formal alliance between the two organizations came to an end. For a time, Communist Workers' Party members frequently got arrested for getting into scuffles with white supremacists. Before changing its name to the New Democratic Movement, the Communist Workers' Party denounced Noam Chomsky as anti-Semitic and began working with liberal Zionists and others against critics of Israel. The Communist Workers' Party became increasingly conservative, mandating that its women not wear pants and that every member join a church and begin teaching Sunday school classes. The Communist Workers' Party endorsed Jesse Jackson in 1984, and the following year formally stopped being a communist organization and became the New Democratic Movement, a social democratic community activist group. The New Democratic Movement lasted only a few years before its members went their separate ways with individual local projects. What remains of the Communist Workers' Party can be found in a variety of Asian American nonprofits linked to the Democrat Party in New York City and in California, the most prominent of which is called Asian Americans for Equality. Former Oakland Mayor Gene Kwan and New York City Council member Margaret Chin were both prominent members of the Communist Workers' Party before becoming regular Democrats with significant support among Asian Americans in their respective cities. In Greensboro, North Carolina, a large African American church called Beloved Community Center, headed by Reverend Nelson Johnson, a former member of the Communist Workers' Party who witnessed the 1979 massacre, functions as a center of liberal activism. The church sends delegations to Cuba and seems to fit some anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist teaching into its overall liberal Christian activist worldview. The 1984 Jesse Jackson campaign also managed to undo the communist politics of many in Amiri Baraka's League of Revolutionary Struggle. The group dissolved, and the few who remained communists began calling themselves the Socialist Organizing Network. In 1986, the Democratic Workers' Party collapsed amid cult allegations and demoralization, expelling its leader Marlene Dixon and liquidating its assets. The bulk of what was left of the DWP merged into Democratic Socialists of America. The group had been the target of the Cult Awareness Network for quite some time, and apparently it was in the process of receiving funding from the communist government of Bulgaria and rebranding as the Alliance Against American Militarism, functioning as a think tank in Washington, D.C. The sudden breakup of the group was likely the work of U.S. intelligence agencies, who detected its new international ties and coordinated with Steve Hassan's anti-cult deprogrammer networks. Janja Lalich, a former member of the Democratic Workers' Party, was rewarded with a position in the anti-cult academic circles, receiving grant money and awards from various foundations linked to Steve Hassan's cult deprogrammer network. In addition to those who just abandoned communism altogether, those who remained communists retreated from any effort to win over the bulk of the American people. The experience of the 1970s and the right-wing turn of the country in response to the economic downturn cemented the idea that average Americans were just not recruitable, and that the communists could only recruit openly function among certain specific marginal arenas of society. Former members of the October League, the Revolutionary Workers Headquarters, and other NCM groups formed the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in 1986. The Socialist Organizing Network and former followers of Amiri Baraka dissolved into Freedom Road in 1994. The group orients its members to get jobs in labor unions and other liberal NGOs and try to maneuver within them while attending secret meetings with other members to struggle over political line. A breakaway called Liberation Road, which is much less anti-imperialist, operates in a similar manner. Freedom Road Socialist Organization members had their homes raided by the FBI in 2010 as part of an investigation into Palestine solidarity activism. An organization and publication called The Line of March emerged in the 1980s as a kind of academic and literary voice of former NCM activists assessing where to go. The group began shifting to support the Soviet Union and its allies in the Cold War and printed a number of different books and magazines for intellectuals interested in communism. The group maintained the radicalism and focus on third world liberation found in the NCM, but oriented its members to support the Democrat Party and to engage with the Communist Party USA as allies. The group called itself the Anti-Dogmatist Non-Revisionist Trend and earned the nickname Left of Moscow for its new international line. Line of March seemed to have been very much a literary, academic, and non-activist formation. At the end of the 1980s, its members gradually trickled away from communism, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some of them joined the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, formed by Angela Davis when she resigned from the Communist Party in 1991. An organization called the Provisional Communist Party operated in secret for several decades, organizing a number of benevolent associations, such as the Eastern Farm Workers Association, the California Homemakers Association, all unified under the name the National Labor Federation, or NATLFed. The group developed methods of fundraising and providing services to low-income workers while recruiting college-aged radicals to be full-time organizers. The group's offices in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, were raided by the FBI in 1984, and several members were imprisoned for possessing forged documents. The offices were raided again by the New York City Police Department in 1996, and a cache of illegal weapons was discovered. The group has faced a slew of cult allegations, and what's left of it operates in several parts of the country as small nonprofits providing services to low-income workers. Members are forbidden from openly talking about communism, and the group continues to be stalked by Steve Hassan's anti-cult networks. In the early 1980s, the Revolutionary Communist Party announced that only the lumpen proletariat had revolutionary potential, and that most U.S. workers were, quote, bourgeoisified. The RCP focused very much on building a culture of appreciation for its chairman in exile, Bob Avakian, and was known for burning the U.S. flag at protests, eventually getting this act legalized by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 1989 ruling. The RCP agitated around police brutality and maintained a visible presence around Black nationalists and Black activist circles in general, despite its members being overwhelmingly white. The RCP was able to consistently attract college-aged radicals, maintaining a network of bookstores in major cities. The RCP held rallies against Ronald Reagan called No Business as Usual. In 1987, they formed an organization called Refuse and Resist, declaring that the U.S. was drifting into fascism as George Herbert Walker Bush was elected president. The RCP seemed to have a well-developed scheme of declaring Republicans to be fascists and organizing alarmist, hysterical demonstrations against them, buying ads in the New York Times, and having rallies as a way of fundraising from liberals. This tactic continues right up to today with Refuse Fascism protests against Trump run by RCP members, though membership is dwindling. Bob Avakian is over 80 years old, and a large chunk of the membership was expelled in 2008 when Avakian's New Synthesis was declared to be a new stage in communist theory, higher than the teachings of Marx, Lenin, or Mao. Only 2 RCP bookstores remain open at this time, but Avakian did manage to have a high-profile hour-long interview with Cornel West played on National Public Radio and a public event with Dr. West at Riverside Church on November 15th, 2014. A small faction called the Rayo Light Group, or the Revolutionary Organization of Labor, has recruited a few prominent labor unionists to its ranks. It publishes a newsletter and holds a very secretive conference to discuss Marxist-Leninist theory and maneuver within the labor bureaucracy once a year. The Prairie Fire Organizing Committee originally started as the above-ground wing of the Weather Underground, and it continued to operate throughout the 1980s and 90s after Ayers and Dorn surrendered. The group emphasized white skin privilege and the notion that solidarity with third world armed struggles should be the focus. And it published a magazine expressing its views. The group was primarily made up of college students who were in awe of Dorn and Ayers for their radical past. Prairie Fire members raised money for members of the Black Liberation Army and the May 19th Communist Organization who remained in prison. The group became less and less visible, with its magazine ceasing publication during the 1990s and its website taken down in 2010. Many former communists became college professors. Their organizations dried up, and the movement experienced a downturn, and they went to grad school. They now get grant money to use their Marxist background to write academic papers or books on gender oppression, white privilege, and other critiques of U.S. society. Community colleges and public universities around the country are staffed with people who once sold Mao's Red Book in their 20s and now teach undergraduates while slipping in edgy talking points about racist, sexist white males and settler colonialism. The tragedy of the new communist movement is that the actions they took from 1969 to 1980 were more or less correct. They went to the broad masses of Americans, especially those who worked in the once vast industrial apparatus of the country, with a communist message. They went out of their way to distinguish themselves from the liberals and to raise a class-conscious, anti-imperialist message. Unfortunately, the ground was not fertile. The bulk of the U.S. working class was still gripped by anti-communism and reveling in the economic gains of the post-World War II economic expansion. The ruling class was able to transform the economic crisis of the late 70s into a right-wing shift by blaming the cultural changes and demoralization that followed the 1960s upsurge. The demoralization, following a decade of limited successes and big defeats, led many to just move away from communism entirely, and those who remained communists to retreat from the real mass work and to view the masses with contempt. Trauma plays an important role in the weakened state of affairs among communist organizations in the United States at this time. Decades of rejection from white workers and violence inflicted on them by Reagan Republicans has many of the most radical sounding anti-imperialists clinging to the Democratic Party as their protector and screaming that Trump and all who back him are fascists. The idea that the bulk of the white working class are irredeemable racists, that Christianity is inherently right-wing and fascist, and that it is necessary to align with the Democrats against conservatives has been cemented into the minds of the leaders of various communist groups that remain throughout years of painful experiences. The groups that continue to function, some rooted in the NCM, others with different roots, do not engage in mass outreach to the bulk of the population. Organizations work to maneuver within the labor bureaucracy, within liberal NGOs, and on college campuses or Black radical spaces. They are often shrouded in a very deep paranoia and delusional understanding of the political system. In addition, the organizations have become accustomed to not seeing growth or success and continue to operate in a routine way, growing smaller and more irrelevant each year. Youth in their late teens who become interested in communism will join one of these groups and after a year or two realize that they have no plan for expanding and no interest in breaking out of their routine. They then quit and move on with their lives. And among many Americans, joining a communist group is viewed as a kind of college phase. people go through in their 20s before moving on. However, the times we are living in are very different than the late Cold War when this great retreat took place, and this state of affairs set in. In 2024, the bulk of the population is opposed to wars and is economically suffering. Anti-communism is being actively taught and emphasized by the far right because the Cold War is fading from American memory. The U.S. public is suffering in an economy that has deteriorated, and racial integration has expanded to the point that the kind of tribalist right-wing backlash of decades before is much harder to foment. Interest in socialism and communism is widespread among millions of Americans, and the economic successes of China and other anti-imperialist countries are quite hard to conceal. The problem is that the various communist organizations that remain are led by people who learned, quote, that winning over the bulk of the population is impossible, and who continue to operate on the assumption that they will always be marginal. Furthermore, the remaining communist sects all more or less hold on to a political understanding from the 1970s and 80s, not offering any solid analysis of Bolivarian socialism, contemporary China, the current economic crisis, and other issues that need to be addressed. In light of these circumstances, the urgent necessity is for mass work aimed at the bulk of the population to commence once again. The Center for Political Innovation aims to serve this purpose. And that's my book, The New Communist Movement, Party Building in 1970s America. A lot of information in there. I've done years of research on communist groups in America, and that is my history of the new communist movement of the 1970s.